This is not a fairy tale, it's reality. In the last few centuries alone, the plague, smallpox, and cholera have claimed hundreds of millions of lives. Hey there, I'm Mr. Imahara. In this video, I'm going to share 7 stories about diseases that could have destroyed us, but instead made us stronger. The plague, the shadow of the Middle Ages. The medieval world is often imagined as a dark and ruthless time. This reputation, unfortunately, is well-deserved. Cities were overcrowded, and living conditions were far from ideal. The lack of basic hygiene turned them into a perfect environment for the spread of the most terrifying and deadly diseases. These invisible enemies decimated entire cities and villages, claiming millions of lives and forever changing the course of human history. In our story of the 7 most lethal diseases of the past, we begin with the plague, one of the greatest nightmares that ever descended upon humanity. The plague spread across the continent with terrifying speed during the Middle Ages, and even today, it remains on the list of the most dangerous infections capable of causing a new global pandemic. It's no wonder that every single resident of Europe lived in fear of it. After the plague swept through a city, it left behind nothing but ruins, deserted streets, abandoned homes, and orphaned lands. No one knew how to escape this invisible threat, as the medicine of the time was powerless. People tried to explain the affliction by believing the disease was caused by bad air, divine punishment for sins, or even an ominous alignment of the stars. In reality, the plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is carried by fleas. These fleas, in turn, become infected by rats and other rodents, which lived in huge numbers in the filthy medieval cities. The disease manifested in 2 primary forms, each of which was deadly and caused indescribable suffering. The first, bubonic plague, was characterized by a series of horrifying symptoms: severe headaches, hallucinations, nausea, and vomiting blood. But the most terrifying sign was the swollen, painful, and blackened lymph nodes, which were called buboes, hence the name. These buboes could grow to the size of a chicken egg and caused unbearable pain. The skin around them quickly darkened, which gave the disease its second, more ominous name, the Black Death. The second form, pneumonic plague, was even more lethal because it attacked the respiratory system. It was accompanied by labored breathing and gangrene of the extremities, leading to a quick and agonizing death. Mortality rates from the plague at that time reached an incredible 95%, making it a virtually unavoidable death sentence. Throughout human history, there have been 3 of the largest plague pandemics. The first was the plague of Justinian, which raged from 541 to 750 and was one of the reasons for the decline of the powerful Byzantine Empire. This was followed by the most famous and devastating, the Black Death, which peaked between 1346 and 1353. This pandemic wiped out 30 to 60% of Europe's population, leading to unthinkable social and economic upheaval. Chaos reigned everywhere. There was a shortage of labor, which led to a sharp increase in wages, and cities were buried under the bodies of the dead. The third pandemic originated in China in 1855 and quickly spread around the world, claiming the lives of more than 12 million people in China and India alone. In total, according to various estimates, more than 200 million people died from the plague, making it one of the most deadly disasters in history.
Smallpox, a terrifying past and a triumph of medicine. Smallpox is one of the most ancient and resilient viral infections, considered for many centuries to be the most widespread in human history. The smallpox virus was astonishingly durable. It could survive at temperatures close to boiling and remain active on various surfaces for many years. For centuries, this disease claimed millions of lives. In medieval Europe, it was almost impossible to find someone who hadn't contracted it in childhood or later in life. In fact, the disease was so common that a face without pockmarks, deep, disfiguring scars, was considered a great rarity and a sign of exceptional luck. The symptoms of the disease were horrifying. The first sign was an eruption of a huge number of red spots that quickly turned into pus-filled ulcers all over the body, covering the face, arms, legs, and torso. These sores, resembling festering boils, made patients feel as if their bodies were literally rotting alive. Afterward, they left behind deep, disfiguring scars. Many who survived the disease were unlucky enough to lose their sight due to eye damage. To hide these ugly scars, people in Europe began to use thick layers of makeup, powder, and blush, which led to the widespread fashion for pale, porcelain skin. From variolation to the first vaccine, the evolution of the fight against smallpox. Despite all the horror and inevitability people faced, humanity didn't give up for centuries, tirelessly searching for ways to combat this terrible disease. Long before true vaccination, there was a practice called variolation. This method was incredibly risky and frightening. A healthy person was deliberately inoculated with material from smallpox sores, hoping it would induce a mild form of the disease. The chances of survival were far from 100%, but for many, it was the only hope of avoiding a much more lethal form of the illness. However, a truly groundbreaking medical breakthrough occurred in 1796 when the English physician Edward Jenner made a brilliant observation. He noticed that milkmaids who often contracted the harmless cowpox didn't get smallpox. This simple but revolutionary idea inspired him to conduct a bold and unprecedented experiment for his time. Jenner inoculated an 8-year-old boy with pus from a cowpox sore of a milkmaid. As he predicted, the boy gained immunity to smallpox. This is how the world's first vaccine was found, a word that, by the way, comes from the Latin word vacca, meaning cow. Despite this great discovery, it took medical professionals and governments nearly 2 centuries to carry out the largest vaccination campaign in human history, organized by the World Health Organization, or WHO. It was an unprecedented global effort that required immense dedication, international cooperation, and the incredible self-sacrifice of medical workers worldwide. Thanks to this coordinated program, the last case of smallpox infection was recorded in 1977. Before that historical moment, smallpox had claimed the lives of 300 to 500 million people worldwide, making it the most lethal infection in human history. Its complete eradication is considered one of medicine's greatest achievements and a vivid example of how science, combined with global cooperation, can defeat even the most terrifying diseases. This triumph wasn't just a victory over a virus, but also a symbol of hope for future generations, proof that humanity is capable of overcoming the darkest challenges.
The Spanish flu, a silent killer born of war. Swiftly and without warning, like a storm, the Spanish flu, or La Gripe Españole as it was also known, descended upon humanity. This pandemic of 1918-1919, caused by a particularly aggressive H1N1 virus, infected more than 550 million people worldwide, a third of the planet's population. Ironically, the disease got its name not because it originated in Spain, it's believed to have started in US military camps, but because Spanish newspapers, unrestricted by wartime censorship, were the first to openly write about the true scale of the epidemic. Meanwhile, other countries involved in World War I hid the information to avoid undermining morale and causing public panic. The most terrifying thing about the Spanish flu was its incredible speed and lethality. In some cases, patients died just 1 or 2 days after the first symptoms appeared. While the disease could be almost asymptomatic in its early stages, in later stages it caused bloody coughing, severe pneumonia, and a bluish skin color, cyanosis, due to an acute lack of oxygen. As a result of heavy internal bleeding in the lungs, many patients simply drowned in their own blood, making death particularly agonizing. Unlike common flu, the Spanish flu was especially deadly for young, healthy people between the ages of 20 and 40. It's believed that their strong immune systems overreacted to the virus, causing a cytokine storm that led to the rapid and irreversible death of organs and tissues. The virus's spread was facilitated by technological advancements and, most importantly, World War I.
The mass movement of troops around the world, along with trains, airships, and fast ships, turned the planet into a single hotbed of infection. To slow the spread, authorities in some countries took strict measures. They closed courts, schools, churches, theaters, and cinemas, and cities introduced mandatory mask wearing, similar to what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to various estimates, the Spanish flu claimed the lives of 50 to 100 million people, making it one of the most devastating pandemics in history. This tragedy showed how vulnerable the world is to an invisible threat and how quickly a disease can spread in a time of global conflict. Cholera, an invisible enemy from the water. Throughout its history, humanity has suffered from cholera, an infectious disease transmitted through contaminated fresh water. This invisible enemy terrified entire nations, as the very water that gives life could suddenly become a cause of death. With the development of trade routes and passenger transport in the 18th century, cholera was able to spread across the world at an incredible speed. From 1817 to 1961, Europe experienced 7 major pandemics, one of which claimed the lives of nearly 2 million people, sowing chaos and fear. For a long time, just as with the plague, it was believed that cholera was transmitted through the air via so-called miasmas, foul-smelling vapors from decaying organic matter. People believed that simply breathing in this bad air was enough to get sick. This dangerous and long-lasting myth was dispelled thanks to the genius and persistence of the British physician John Snow. During a cholera outbreak in London in 1854, he conducted one of the first major epidemiological studies in history. Snow manually mapped every case of the disease and was surprised to find that they all clustered around a single street water pump on Broad Street. His conclusions were simple and revolutionary. The disease was not transmitted through the air, but through water. By convincing the authorities to remove the pump handle, he managed to make the outbreak subside. This discovery was a turning point, irrefutably proving that cholera is waterborne and ushering in a new era of epidemiology. Deadly dehydration and the modern fight. Once inside the body, the cholera bacterium releases a powerful toxin that causes severe diarrhea and vomiting. In severe cases, a person can lose fluid so rapidly that they can die from dehydration just a few hours after the first symptoms appear. This condition is excruciating and life-threatening. Today, thanks to medical advancements, this disease is easily treatable with oral rehydration therapy, solutions of salts and sugar. This simple and effective method helps replenish lost fluids and save a patient's life. However, despite scientific progress, cholera remains a serious problem in developing and poor countries where there is no access to clean water and sanitation, regularly causing epidemic outbreaks. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people suffer from this disease, which in essence should have been eradicated long ago. Some experts are seriously concerned that ongoing environmental degradation and the worsening quality of drinking water could lead to new epidemics even in developed countries, making the fight for clean water and sanitation more relevant than ever. Ultimately, the history of the fight against cholera is a story of how scientific knowledge and public health are interconnected, and how even in the 21st century, basic hygiene remains the foundation of safety for all of humanity.
Typhus, an inevitable companion of war and poor sanitation. Typhus is an acute infectious disease that, until the early 20th century, was a faithful and ruthless companion of wars and disasters.
This disease was transmitted from an infected person to a healthy one through lice. Overcrowding, poor hygiene, and widespread unsanitary conditions, characteristic of army barracks, trenches, refugee camps, and prisons, created ideal conditions for the spread of lice and consequently the disease. History knows countless examples with the number of typhus victims during wars and conflicts often exceeded the losses in the battles themselves. It's no wonder that even great military leaders acknowledged its lethality. Napoleon Bonaparte attributed the defeat of his Russian campaign to typhus, which decimated a large part of his army, rendering it combat ineffective. The disease was characterized by an exhausting high fever, a specific rash all over the body, and damage to the nervous and cardiovascular systems. Patients often fell into a typhoid state, a severe delirium, stupor, and apathy, completely losing touch with reality. Complications included a high risk of internal hemorrhaging, including in the brain, which often led to a quick and agonizing death. Between 1917 and 1921, in post-revolutionary Russia, about 3 million people died from typhus, making it one of the largest epidemics of that time. A turning point in the fight against typhus was the invention of an effective vaccine in 1942, which significantly reduced the incidence among military personnel and the civilian population. However, it was only with the advent of antibiotics after World War II that typhus was truly defeated. These drugs made the disease curable and forever changed its status from a death sentence to a treatable condition. Today, typhoid fever is more common, a disease with similar symptoms but transmitted through contaminated food and water rather than lice. Although this disease is rare in developed countries, it still poses a serious threat in regions with poor sanitation and limited access to clean water. This reminds us of the importance of maintaining a high level of hygiene and sanitation to prevent the return of these old but still dangerous diseases. The history of the fight against typhus is a vivid example of how science and hygiene can free humanity from the most terrible calamities.
Scurvy, the curse of the seas, and a triumph of the scientific method. Even a simple vitamin deficiency could be a death sentence in the Middle Ages. Scurvy is a disease caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, which is vital for the human body. The first mentions of it date back to the Crusades, but it gained its truly sinister fame as the scourge of the seas, becoming a real curse for sailors. During long sea voyages, when fresh fruits and vegetables were absent from the diet, scurvy claimed hundreds of lives on every ship. For example, in 1495, Vasco da Gama's expedition lost more than 100 crew members on their way to India, specifically because of this disease. From 1600 to 1800, about 1 million seafarers died from scurvy, which exceeds the human losses in all naval battles of that time. Often, ships could not continue their journey because most of the crew was incapacitated. The symptoms of scurvy were horrifying and progressed over time. In the early stages, blood vessels became fragile, a rash appeared on the body, gums started to bleed, and teeth loosened and fell out. As the disease advanced to later stages, extensive hemorrhages developed under the skin, causing huge, painful bruises. Old wounds seemed to reopen, refusing to heal. In addition, patients' immunity sharply declined and they developed anemia, making them vulnerable to other infections. A discovery that saved millions of lives. For centuries, scurvy was considered a mysterious, incurable infectious disease. Sailors and doctors were completely clueless about its causes. However, in 1747, the British physician James Lind, who worked at a naval hospital, conducted one of the first clinical experiments in history, pioneering modern medicine. He divided 6 sailors into groups and gave each different supplements: vinegar, sulfuric acid, barley water, and finally, citrus fruits, oranges and lemons. The group that received citrus fruits recovered. This simple yet revolutionary discovery put an end to the centuries of suffering for sailors. Eventually, the British Navy made it mandatory to include lemon juice in the sailors' diet, which allowed them to permanently defeat this disease on ships. The history of the fight against scurvy is a prime example of how the scientific method and observation can save millions of lives. It was a triumph of common sense over superstition and ignorance.
Leprosy from a curse to a curable disease. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease, is one of the darkest and most tragic chapters in human history. Mentions of it are found in antiquity, but its true rise as a social catastrophe occurred during the Middle Ages. In those days, leprosy was not just seen as a disease, but a terrible heavenly punishment for the gravest sins. Society, gripped by fear, completely isolated lepers, creating special quarantine places for them called leprosaria, or houses for lepers. To be sent there was a form of civil death. A person lost all their rights and connections to the outside world. Leprosy is a chronic infectious disease caused by a bacterium that slowly but surely affects the skin, peripheral nervous system, eyes, and limbs. The suffering of patients was not only physical, but also psychologically harrowing. To emphasize their complete isolation, the infected person was symbolically buried alive in a ritual of death to the world. They would be symbolically placed in a coffin, lowered into a grave, and lightly covered with soil. From that moment on, they were considered dead by their loved ones and were forever isolated from society. Patients were often given dark cloaks with hoods and bells, the sound of which was meant to warn others of a leper's approach. They were feared, hated, and shunned. Modern medicine versus centuries of prejudice. The peak of leprosy incidents occurred between the 12th and 14th centuries, with outbreaks recorded all over Europe, causing widespread panic. However, today, leprosy is a completely curable disease. Thanks to modern multi-drug therapy, MDT, developed by the World Health Organization, the disease can be diagnosed in its early stages and fully cured, avoiding irreversible consequences. Nevertheless, a late diagnosis can still lead to lasting physical changes and disability. It's important to note that leprosy is no longer a death sentence and is no longer the social stigma it was in the Middle Ages. This progress is not just medical, but social as well. It is another striking example of how science and humanity can change attitudes toward a disease, transforming it from a shameful curse into a treatable condition.
Each of these invisible enemies challenged humanity. In your opinion, which of these challenges was the most terrifying? Be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to do it.